Origin and Function of the Party Form by Camatte. General premises. The central thesis that we wish to state and illustrate is that Marx and Engels derived the characteristics of the party form from the description of communist society. We shall attempt to indicate, methodologically, as far as possible, the link between the different works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and the Italian left. We shall, in short, use all the elements from the Marxist school. Some points will, moreover, be indicated but not studied fundamentally. The struggle of the embryonic proletariat in the French Revolution led to some revolutionaries, Varlet, Leclerc, Roux, i.e. the Enrages, to believe that the revolution could only benefit a category of people and that it was not universally liberatory. At the same time, however, the Egaux questioned in the possibility of this revolution liberating humanity. Thus they proclaimed the need for a new revolution led in the name of reason, from Marx's critique in the Holy Family. The theory of the universal evolution of reason and of its role is in Hegel's system, which completed the work of the French philosophers and the bourgeois revolutionaries. Moreover, the proletariat was growing in numbers and in its power in society when Marx entered the political scene. It was from Marx's and Engels' observation of the struggle of the proletariat that they gave birth to the idea that the enlightening solution was not the true one, and they also saw that this solution was to be found in the proletariat's struggle. They understood that the question could not be resolved theoretically because the question, the emancipation of humanity, had not been posed practically, since the bourgeoisie thought in terms of an abstract man in a category excluding the proletariat. The liberation of man had to be seen in the area of practice, and one had to reconsider real men, i.e. the human species. Marx went on to criticize the Hegelian system, armed with this inspired intuition. He found out why the dialectic was on its head. He attacked the monster with reckless enthusiasm. Marx was the new Oedipus, who resolved the enigmas. He returned to the field of practice when the difficulties grew too great, and threw what was real in old Hegel's face, the existence of the proletariat. Since he was anti-modern, Marx always drew new strength from the proletariat to support the fight. Explaining the proletariat struggle, we shall try as often as possible to underline this aspect. Marx noted all the practical and theoretical struggles, and he was also in the current of work of other fighters, such as Engels, Moses Hess, the French Socialists, etc. Thus, the summation was finally made: the theory of the proletariat, the theory of the human species, which appeared in all its power in the full phase of the eruptive development of human society, the 1848 revolution with the Communist Manifesto. Thus, Marxism is the product of the whole of human history, but it can only be born by the proletariat struggle, which has no ideals to realize, but to set free the elements of the new society with which the old collapsing bourgeois society itself is pregnant. Our work today is that of trying to explain how the inspired intuition has become reality, the communist program, how the program was proposed to humanity through the medium of the proletariat, how Marx and Engels fought for its acceptance by the proletarian organization. The history of the International was a continual struggle of the General Council against the individual sections. How it won in 1871 with the Paris Commune, which showed the absolute need for it, need expressed its verification and validity. We shall study all of that so as to specify the origin and function of the party form. Finally, we shall deal with the question with the reasoning that the only activity within a reality is that of the program, i.e. the necessity. Capitalism no longer exists for us. Only communist society does. On the theme that our theory is the only one able to base itself on a future action. Origin of the party form. One has to know how human consciousness evolved in order to understand Marx's critique of bourgeois society. Leaving aside the period of primitive communism in the phase of its degeneration, beginning class society, there are three main movements. Two straight away. 1. Knowledge mediated by God. 2. Knowledge mediated by individual man. Capitalist period. In the second phase, it is a matter of knowing what is man, the writing on man by the bourgeois philosophers such as Hume, Locke, and Helvetius. One proceeds from the abstract definition of individual man, characterized by reason, to the problem of knowing what is the best form of society, allowing an optimum development of this man, Therefore, with the best social organization, which will guarantee the most rational development of humanity, seeing as the sum of all people alive at a certain stage, is, finally, given that the human spirit is perfectible, the masses have to be educated for the liberation of man. Marx destroyed the Hegelian monster in an implacable critique in the Paris manuscripts. In the critique of the state of Hegel's philosophy of right, law being the link among individuals and between them and the state, and in On the Jewish Question, and came to grasp the real meaning of the movement of his human society in its totality, humanity as a whole, tended to communism, described thus. Communism as the positive transcendence of private property, as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism therefore as the complete return of man to himself as a social, i.e. human being. A return accomplished consciously and embracing the entire wealth of the previous developments. This communism, as fully developed naturalism, equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man. The true resolution of the strife between the existence of, in essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. Communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. The entire movement of human history, just as is communism's actual act of genesis. The birth act of its empirical existence is therefore, also for its thinking consciousness, the comprehended and known process of its becoming. The character of the proletariat is to be a class of civil society, which is not a class of civil society, in a state which is the dissolution of all estates. A sphere which has universal character by its universal suffering and claims no particular right because no particular wrong, but wrong generally, is perpetuated against it, which can no longer invoke a historical but only human title. Here too we find the basic constant of Marxism. The criteria for judging truth of error is that of the species, which interests us is not a contingent and transitory fact, but the human being, which mediates all knowledge and action. The proletariat does not found its action in history on the ownership of a certain means of production, and so the partial liberation of man, but on the non-possession of human nature, which wishes to appropriate and thus emancipate man. Which does not stand in any one-side antithesis to the consequences, but an all-round antithesis to the premises of the German state. A sphere, finally, which cannot emancipate itself without emancipating itself from all other spheres of society, and thereby emancipating all other spheres of society, which in a word is the complete loss of man, and hence can win itself only through the complete re-winning of man. This dissolution of society, as a particular state, is the proletariat. The following quotation from the Holy Family again specifies what has just been stated. Indeed, private property drives itself in its economic movement toward its own dissolution, but only through a development which does not depend on it, which is unconscious and which takes place against the will of private property by the very nature of things, only inasmuch as it produces the proletariat as proletariat. Poverty, which is conscious of its spiritual and physical property, dehumanization, which is conscious of its dehumanization, and therefore self-abolishing. The proletariat executes the sentence that private property pronounces on itself by producing the proletariat, just as it executes the sentence that wage labor pronounces on itself by producing wealth for others and poverty for itself. When the proletariat is victorious, it by no means becomes the absolute side of society, for it is victorious only by abolishing itself and its opposition. Then the proletariat disappears, as well as the opposition, which determines it private property. When socialist writers describe this world historic role to the proletariat, it is not at all as critical criticism pretends to believe, because they regard the proletariat as gods. Rather the contrary, since in the form of proletariat, the abstraction of all humanity, even of the semblance of humanity, is practically complete, since the conditions of life of the proletariat sum up all the conditions of life of society today in their most inhumane form. Since man has lost himself in the proletariat, yet at the same time has not only gained theoretical consciousness of the loss, but through urgent, no longer removable, no longer disguisable, absolute imperative need, the practical expression of necessity is driven directly to revolt against this inhumanity. It follows that the proletariat can and must emancipate itself, but it cannot emancipate itself without abolishing the conditions of its own life. It cannot abolish its own life without abolishing all the inhuman conditions of life and of society today, which are summed up in its own situation. Not in vain does it go through the stern but skilling school of labor. It is not a question of what this or that proletarian, or even the whole of the proletariat, but at the moment regards as its aim. It is a question of what the proletariat is, and what in accordance with it being will it historically be compelled to do. Its aim in historical action is visible and irrevocably foreshadowed in its own life situation, and as well in the whole organization of bourgeois society today. There is no need to explain here that a large part of English and French proletariat is already conscious of its historical task, and is constantly working to develop that consciousness into complete clarity. Thus, the problem of the becoming of the proletariat is that of knowing how the question of classes in the state would be resolved. Thus also the question of the future society. The bourgeoisie tended, moreover, to prevent the realization of the organic link between the class and its program. It tended to reduce the proletariat to a class of this society, and to do so made it abandon its program. Here it is the theoretical location of the question of the party. All these questions were not dealt with individually, the reply was made as a whole. Marx had the intuition of the future society, and went on to draw out the theory of the state and the party in his knowledge. All of Marx and Engels' work was to be the description of this society and its defense against bourgeois society. The following article in the Paris Vortworts enables us to show this. The nature of the state. Marx analyzed here what the state is. From the political point of view, the state and the system of society are not two different things. The state is a system of society insofar as the state admits the existence of social defects. It sees their cause either in the law of some nature, which no human power can command, A, or in private life, which does not depend on the state, or in the inexpedient activity of the administration, which does not depend on it. He then analyzed the faults of the state and the remedies involved. Finally, every state seeks the cause in accidental or deliberate shortcomings of the administration, and therefore it seeks the remedy for all ills in its measure of the administration. Why? Precisely because administration is the organizing activity of the state. Here we already see the critique of bureaucracy, which some now wish to present us as a class. We can also note Marx's keen interest in questions of the definition of the mechanisms of the state. It was thus that he was closely to follow the measures taken by the Paris Commune. The importance of administration had to be limited and simplified in order that the bureaucratic phenomenon could disappear, and given the link with authority, prevent membership of the administration being accompanied with privileges. Later, Marx envisaged that the different contradictions linked with the state and criticized the reformists, who were those who wanted to fix the, quote, faults of the state, which are by their very nature irreparable. Suicide is against nature. Therefore, the state cannot believe in the inherent impotence of the administration, i.e. in its own impotence. It can perceive only formal accidental deficiencies in the administration and try to remedy them. Here, the position of the Stalinists and various Democrats is defined very precisely, but this did not satisfy Marx. He scoffed at his adversaries by showing them their impotence. And if these modifications prove fruitless, the conclusion is drawn that social ills are a natural imperfection independent of man, a law of God, or that the will of private individuals is too spoilt to be able to respond to the good intentions of the administration. And how preposterous these private individuals are. They grumble at the government wherever it restricts their freedom. At the same time, they demand that the government prevent the inevitable result of this freedom. This is a critique of the Stalinists who want a strong democratic power, who grumble each time de Gaulle restrains freedom and increases the power of the state. They do not agree on the form of the state. Marx mocked these illusions, showing the state is the organized power of a class which dominated society. For this fragmentation, this baseness, this slavery of civil society, it is the natural foundation on which the modern state rests. Just as the civil society of slavery was the natural foundation on which the ancient state rested, the existence of the state and the existence of slavery are inseparable. Marx took this impossibility of reformism to its extreme by criticizing Rouge's position, which stated the smothering of the uprising, which breaks out in the disastrous isolation of people from the community, Gemeinwesen, and its separation of their thoughts from social principles. That is to say, the state has to be used to liberate the proletariat if one wishes to avoid a check. This position was to be readopted by Lassalle, Proudhon, Dühring, etc. Marx replied by analyzing what the bourgeois in the other revolutions were. But do not all uprisings, without exception, break out in disastrous isolation of man from the community? Does not every uprising necessarily presuppose isolation? Would the 89 revolution have taken place without the disastrous isolation of French citizens from the community? It was intended precisely to abolish this isolation. The proletarian path is not inside the state. Do the facts of the proletarian struggle appear in exactly the same manner? No. But the community from which the worker is isolated is a community the real character and scope of which is quite different from that of the political community. The community from which the worker is isolated by his own labor is life itself, physical and mental life, human morality, human activity, human enjoyment, human nature. Here, the critique achieves totality because it is radical, not because it is radical. But to be radical is to grasp the root of the matter. But for man, the root is man himself. The poverty of the proletariat is its separation from its human nature. This critique supersedes the narrow limits of Proudhon's, which was merely a rational impoverishment and thus even a derationalization of the real poverty of man. The Stalinists, with their theory of absolute poverty, are the real inheritors of the Proudhon and Issue. The claim of the proletariat was manifested in its will to reappropriation its human nature, and Marx defined the communist program as human nature is the true community of men. So the state does not exist in communist society. The principle of authority, of organization and coordination between men is the human species. It is the return to primitive communism, but also integrating the intermediate evolution, the previous citation on communism. The human species has been represented imperfectly and fraudulently beforehand, i.e.g. the totem. Men delimited themselves in relation to it, according to a participation with it. Their individual existence was not separate from that of the species. The split between the two showed up when class society was established, attaining its great development in the existence of the proletariat. It is this poverty that Marx expresses in all its universality, the poverty due to the separation from the Gemeinwesen. The disastrous isolation from this essential nature is incomparably more universal, more intolerable, more dreadful, and more contradictory than isolation from the political community. Hence, too, the abolitionist isolation and even a partial reaction to it, an uprising against it, is just as much more infinite as man is more infinite than the citizen, and human life more infinite than political life. Some Philistine, i.e. some vulgar Democrat, will think that clever Marx drew all that from his powerful brain, because for him, some Philistine, reflection is the exclusive property of some brain activity. If not, farewell, division of labor. In fact, it was not so. The proletariat is the living manifestation of Marx's thought of the enunciation of the universality of poverty, and thus of the universality of its liberation. Therefore, however partial the uprising of the industrial worker may be, it contains within itself a universal soul. However universal a political uprising may be, it conceals even in its most grandiose form a narrow-minded spirit. If this can be considered a critique of Blanquism, it is all the more powerful blow at Proudhon, whose shabby thought discovered a day when the working class did not have a political ability, thus it could not govern. His refusal, as with other anarchists, correctly to envisage the economic, then the trade union struggle. Marx continued, "We have already seen that a social revolution is found to have a point of view of the whole, because even if it were to occur only in one factory district, it represents man's protest against a dehumanized life, because it starts out from the point of view of a separate real individual, because a community, against the separation of which from himself the individual reacts, is man's true community, human nature. The proletariat tends to oppose its own Gemeinwesen, the human being, to the capitalist one, the oppressive state. It has to expropriate this being to realize his real opposition. It can only do so if it organizes in a party. This is the representation of its being, its prefiguration, the whole life of the class. Thus, the party is dominated by the movement of the appropriation of this being. Here, the consciousness of the mission of the proletariat is expressed specifically as the appropriation of human nature. The revolution in the states. The discovery of the direction of the movement of human society, the movement towards communist society, is concomitant with that of the rediscovery of man, thus the simultaneous manifestation of the need to appropriate the latter's nature. All that defined the program. Marx characterized the bourgeois revolution to specify this. The political soul of the revolution, on the other hand, consists in the tendency of classes having no particular influence to abolish their isolation from statehood and rule. The bourgeoisie possessed means of production and feels society, which gave it a power unrecognized by the state. Hence the need to be separated from the German-Weisen no longer. That is why the bourgeoisie dismantled the dissolution of the different estates. Henceforth, they would only be people, because their existence was the legal expression of its actual estrangement. It pronounced that all social layers would participate in the state. In fact, only owners would participate, the different constitutions and analysis of them by Marx. Hence the wish of the bourgeoisie for all that of property, its utopian character, which assured equally among individuals, but also gave self-consciousness to each individual. Basically then, the bourgeoisie realized a political revolution. We proletarians cannot be satisfied with such a revolution because its point of view is that of the state, of an abstract whole, which exists only through the separation of real life, and which is inconceivable without the organized contradiction between the universal idea of man and the individual existence of man. Therefore, the proletariat had to conquer power, but it must not struggle for a so-called more progressive form against another. It does so when it struggles of one side of the bourgeoisie against another, democracy and fascism. Its action must be external. The proletariat has to abolish the opposition between the individual and the species to make the revolution. The contradiction on which the present state rests, while there are individuals, there is the problem of their organization in society, and this exists in the relation of the organization to the needs of human species. The proletariat must not make a revolution with a political aim, because this organizes a ruling stratum in society at the expense of society itself. Then, before going into the characterization of the proletarian revolution, he stated every revolution overthrows the old power, and to that extent it is political. The bourgeois revolution is thus a social revolution, while it dissolves old society, and political when it destroys the old political power. But it definitely strengthening its own political power, at least it hopes to do so, it creates only a political revolution. Because the bourgeoisie had to use a political organization to establish its social organization, which is inseparable from the former. Why? Because the bourgeoisie made a revolution that wishes to create an abstract human. The individual separated from nature in his own species, because it wanted to liberate men from the old feudal relations, dependence of men on each other and on nature. The problem was to define what would be the relations between the new men. That is why the Declaration of the Rights of Men and the Citizen were formulated, and which were only realized when the revolution entered its practical bourgeois terrain. When it lost the hope of really liberating humanity, after having destroyed a movement like the sans-culottes. For Marxism, on the other hand, man is the human species. Social human has a human league. Social man has a human link with the species and a human link with nature, domination of it. Clearly, the proletarian state cannot be a special organ regulated by clearly formulated rules, but whatever right will be of the human being. But socialism cannot be realized without a revolution. It needs this political act insofar as it needs destruction and dissolution, but where its organizing activity begins, its proper object, its soul, comes to the fore. There socialism throws off the political cloak. The Proletarian Parties. Marx's later work was to study how to realize that. That is why he went to a specific study society and indicated the main features of its transformation: property of the species, destruction of the exchange, etc. He stated all in the manifesto, then, about the Commune, in the Civil War in France, the question of the destruction of the bourgeois state, and the means of limiting careerism, among other things. The party thus represents the German-Weisen. It cannot be defined by its bureaucratic roles, but only by its existence and the party's existence in its program, the prefiguration of communist society, of the liberated and conscious human species. The corollary is that the revolution is not a question of forms of organization. It depends on the program. Only one proves that the party form is the one most suited to represent and to defend the program. The organizational roles in this case are not adopted from bourgeois society, but derived from the vision of the future society, as we shall show. Marx derived the originality of the party from the proletariat struggle. From the start, the proletariat manifested itself as a new German-Weisen. It manifested the goal it tended to, a society without private property, but with property of the species instead. The proletariat at once, in a striking, sharp, unrestrained, and powerful manner, proclaimed its opposition to society of private property. The Silesian uprising begins precisely with that of the French and English workers' uprisings in the consciousness of the nature of the proletariat. The action itself bears the stamp of this superior character. Not only machines, these rivals of the workers, are destroyed, but also ledgers, the titles of property to property, and while all the other movements were aimed primarily only against the owner of the industrial enterprise, the visible enemy, this movement is at the same time directly against the banker, the hidden enemy. Finally, not a single English worker uprising was carried out with such courage through thought and endurance. It is another to compare these gigantic infant shoes of the proletariat with the dwarfish, worn-out political shoes of the German bourgeoisie. And one is bound to prophesy that the German Cinderellas will one day have to figure out an athlete. It has to be admitted that the German proletariat is the theoretician of the European proletariat, just as the English proletariat is its economist and the French proletariat its politician. In all these cases, it was with the struggle of the proletarians which was the critique of the different aspects of human activity. Knowledge does not come to us directly from the bourgeoisie, as some wish us to say. It comes from the struggle of our class. It is not a particular sphere of our activity which arrives passively from the opposing class. It is something moving and impassioned which has been taken from its class enemy by the proletariat. The young Marx was completely correct in writing about the ideas of communism, which have conquered our intellect and taken possession of our minds. Ideas to which reason has fettered our consciousness are chains from which one cannot free oneself without a broken heart. They are demons which human beings can vanquish only by submitting to them. Marx had thus integrated three facts and retransmitted them to the proletariat in the form of theses forming the communist program. This was therefore born of struggle, and it is impersonal force above generations. Marx and Engels were the substrate of the first universal consciousness and transmitted it to us. Marx made clear from the start that the program was not an individual's product. That coincides with what we have often said, that the revolution will be anonymous or will not be. But this goal, this liberation, is precisely the one that society tends towards, as the liberation of the proletariat is a liberation of humanity, a constant affirmation of Marxism. The program, born in the struggle, can only be affirmed by it. This leads us to considering the conditions for the struggle against capital, thus the condition for the link between the proletarians and thus the program. We have to separate the periods of revolution and counter-revolution. The proletarians only support their mission when they have no reserves. Let us integrate that into the dynamic of society, in the class struggle. Can capitalism assure a reserve for the proletariat, give it security? All that is related to the problem of the crises, and the different cases that can occur are explained in the Rome Theses. An important characteristic of the party is derived from the fact that it is the prefiguration of the person and the communist society. It is the mediating base of all knowledge for the proletariat, i.e., for the person refusing the bourgeois Gemeinwesen and accepting the proletarian one. The knowledge of the party integrates all of the past centuries, religion, art, philosophy, science. Marxism is not only a scientific theory, among so many others, but also incorporates science and uses its revolutionary arm of foresight and transformation to achieve the goal of revolution. The party is an organ of foresight. If not, it is discredited. The middle-class party in Prussia discredited itself and brought on its president miserly, chiefly because it seriously believed that the new era power, by the grace of the Prince Regent, had fallen onto its lap. But the Workers' Party will discredit itself far more if it imagines that in the Bismarck era, or in the other Prussian era, the golden apples which drop into its mouth by the grace of the king. The disappointment will follow Lassalle's hapless illusion that the Prussian government would carry out a socialist intervention is beyond doubt. The logic of things will tell, just the horror of the Workers' Party demands that it should reject such illusions, even before the hollowness is exposed by experience. Why that? Because the working class is revolutionary, or it is nothing. This is the essential characteristic of the proletariat. Party and revolution. We have thus specified the links between the program and the class, between the state and the class. We must now state how the liberation movement is constituted by the revolution. What will the revolution's character be? It will be violent. For although industry makes a country rich, it also creates a class of unpropertied, absolutely poor people. For a class which lives from hand to mouth, which multiplies rapidly, and which cannot afterwards be abolished, because it can never acquire stable possession of property. And a third, almost half of all English people belong to this class. The slightest stagnation in trade deprives a considerable part of the class of their bread. Then such a situation occurs. What is there left for these people to do but revolt? By its numbers, this class has become the most powerful in England, and will betide the wealthy Englishman when it becomes conscious of this fact. So far, it is not conscious of the fact. The English proletarian is only just becoming aware of his power, and the fruit of this awareness were the disturbances of last summer. The nature of these disturbances was quite misunderstood on the continent. At any rate, people wondered whether the matter might not take a serious turn, but there was no question that for anyone who saw the events on the spot, in the first place, the whole thing was based on an illusion, because a few factory owners wanted to reduce wages. All of the workers in cotton, coal, and iron areas thought that their position was endangered, which was not the case at all. Moreover, the whole affair was unprepared, unorganized, and without leadership. The strikers had no definite aim. Still less were they united on the nature and method of their actions to be taken. Hence, at the slightest resistance on the part of the authority, they became irresolute and unable to overcome their respect for the law. When the Chartists took over the leadership of the movement and proclaimed the People's Charter to the assembled crowds, it was already too late. The only guiding idea vaguely present in the minds of the workers, and the Chartists as well, with whom it had in effect originated, was that of revolution by legal means. In itself a contradiction, a practical impossibility, in their effort to achieve which they failed. The very first measure jointly undertaken by all stopping the factories was forcible and illegal. In view of the inconsistent character of the whole of the undertaking, it would not have been suppressed at the very outset if the administration, for whom it came as a complete surprise, had not been equally irresolute and resourceless. Nevertheless, insignificant military and police forces sufficed to hold the people in check. At Manchester, one saw thousands of workers trapped in the squares by 4 or 5 dragoons, each of whom blocked one of the exits. The legal revolution had paralyzed everything. Thus, the whole thing fizzled out. Every worker returned to the work as soon as his savings were used up and had no more to eat. However, the dispossessed had gained something useful from these events. The realization that a revolution by peaceful means is impossible, and that only a forcible abolition of the existing unnatural conditions, a radical overthrow of the nobility and industrial aristocracy, can improve the material position of the proletariat. They are still held back from this violent revolution by the Englishman's inherent respect for the law, but in the view of England's position described above, there cannot fall to be a general lack of food among the workers before long. And then fear of death from starvation will be stronger than fear of the law. The risk of revolution is inevitable for England, but as in everything that happens there, it will be interested in not principles that will begin and carry through the revolution. Principles can only develop from interest. That's to say, the revolution will be social, not political. Here, Engels anticipated Marx's conclusion in the Paris Vortwärts article. He also described magnificently the proletariat without the party. Unfortunately, the English proletariat was unable to separate itself from the bourgeois Gemeinwesen. On the contrary, a kind of alliance between the two classes came into existence to exploit the world. It is well known that in England, parties coincide with social ranks and classes, that the Tories are identical with the aristocracy and the bigoted, strictly orthodox section of the Church of England, that the Whigs consist of manufacturers, merchants, and dissenters of the upper middle class as a whole, that the lower middle class constitute the so-called radicals, and that finally, Chartism has its strength in the working men, the proletarians. The socialism does not form a closed political party, but on the whole, it derives its support from the lower middle class and the proletarians. Thus in England, the remarkable fact is seen that the lower the position of a class in society, the more uneducated it is in the usual sense of the word, and the more closely it is connected with progress, and the greater is its future. In general, this is a feature of every revolutionary epoch, as was seen in particular in the religious revolution of which the outcome was Christianity. The blessed are the poor. The wisdom of this world is foolishness. But its portent of a great Christianity, of a great revolution, had probably never been so clearly expressed and so sharply delineated as now in England and Germany. the movement proceeds from the class which is not only educated but also learned. Thus is answered the famous anarchizing question: have the masses to be educated to organize the revolution? Resulting from what have just written, it is the proletariat only exists when it is revolutionary, when it has its aim in its program. It opposes its state, the human being, to bourgeois society. Otherwise it is debased and its aim is bourgeois. It becomes something in the society. Then it is no longer has a life as its life is revolution. This is why the Communist Manifesto states, political power, property so called, is merely organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away the force of the old condition of production. Then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. Class party program and revolution. All that is specified. The class does not act and does not exist outside of what is formed as the party characterized its program, which is its aim. The party can only realize its mission through a revolution. Marx and Engels did not content themselves with an intuition. They showed the reality of the program. Every time the question of the revolutionary struggle was not central to their activity, they returned to the theoretical studies to specify the program. They discovered the general law, the overall law, and after specified the particular ones. These studies were not only an enrichment, but also a potential reinforcement. They performed then, while in contact with the proletariat struggles, question of the state and of the commune. These studies allowed the specification of the description of communist society, and so the modes for attaining it too, by an extrapolation into the past. They specified the evolution of human society, indications of society with no class struggle, primitive communism, an extrapolation verified during its publication of Morgan's work, thus losing the nature of an extrapolation. Well used by Engels and Harks. It is thus one's view that the latter work of Capital, one can state that there are three essential movements here, that of capital's birth, that of fully developed capital, and finally the one of communist society. To avail the historical movement in its real becoming, Marx opposed them without noting that he went from one to another. This is why it was so easy for Stalinists to theorize that capital gave no indication of communist society. The tormented cycle of the World Party. As an historical product, the program could only be born in the proletarian struggle. Marx and Engels had to reveal it to the working class in humanity in 1848 with the Communist Manifesto. They had to explain it clearly in the IWMA rules. Now it is a question of how it is imposed, why the proletariat abandons it in certain periods, what are the conditions for its rediscovery. This is the question of the formation, the question of its reconstruction resolved at the Naples and Rome meetings of 1951. The first phase of the workers' movement was the sectarian phase. The first phase in the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie is marked by sectarianism. This is because the proletariat has not yet reached the stage of being sufficiently developed to act as a class. Individual thinkers provide a critique of social antagonisms and put forward fantastic solutions which the mass of the workers can only accept, pass on, and put into practice. By their very nature, the sects established by these initiators are abstentionists, strangers to all genuine action, to politics, to strikes, to coalitions, in brief, to any unified movement. The mass of the proletariat always remains unmoved by, if not hostile to, their propaganda. The workers of Paris and Lyons did not want the Saint-Simonians, Fourierists, or Icarians, any more than the Chartists and trade unionists of England wanted the Owenists. All these sects, though at first they provided an impetus to the movement, become an obstacle to it once it has moved further forward. They then become reactionary, as witnessed the sects in France and England, and more recently the Lassalleans in Germany, who, having for years hampered the organization of the proletariat, have finally become nothing less than tools of the police. In fact, we have here the proletarian movement still in its infancy, comparable perhaps to the time when astrology and alchemy were in the infancy of science. For the founding of the International to become a possibility, the proletariat had to develop further, in comparison with the fantastic and mutually antagonistic organization of the sects. The International is the real and militant organization of the proletarian class in every country, linked together in the common struggle against the capitalists, the landowners, and their class power organized in the state. All this period corresponded to that of the post-1815 counter-revolution and saw the greatest development of the secret societies. This is why the Communist Manifesto states, the Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. We shall return to this question with the study of Blanquism, which is simultaneously that of the link of a minority to the mass. For the program to be defended by an organization, the movement had to supersede the stage indicated. Then there is a question of the imposing it. This is why Marx and Engels fought inch by inch in the IWMA to make the program triumph. Let us recall Marx's letter to Bolt. The history of the IMWA was that of a struggle between the London General Council and the national sections. That is, the party acted inside the proletarian organization, and at the 1871 London Conference, the party program won out. Considering the following passage of the preamble to the rules, the economical emancipation of the working class is the great end to which every political movement ought to be subordinate as a means. That the inaugural address of the International Working Men's Association states, the lords of land and lords of capital will always use their political privilege for the defense and perpetuation of their economical monopolies. So far from promoting, they will continue to lay every possible implement in the way of the emancipation of labor. To conquer political power has therefore become the great duty of the working class. That the Congress of Lausanne had passed this revolution, the social emancipation of workmen is inseparable from their political emancipation. That the great declaration of the General Council relative to the pretended plot of the French internationalists on the eve of the plebiscite says, certainly, by the tenor of our statutes, all our branches in England and the continent in America have the special mission not only to serve as censures for the military organization of the working class, but also to support, in their respective countries, every political movement lending towards the accomplishment of our ultimate end, the economical emancipation of the working class. That false translation of the original statutes has given rise to various interpretations, which were mischievous to development and action of the International Working Men's Association. In the presence of an unbridled reaction which violently crushes every effort at emancipation on the working men and pretends to maintain by brute force the distinction of classes and political domination of the property classes resulting from it, considering that against this collective power of the property classes, the working class cannot act, as a class, except by constituting itself into a political party, distinct from and opposed to all old parties formed by the property classes. That this constitution of the working class into a political party is indispensable in order to ensure the triumph of the social revolution in its ultimate end, the abolition of classes. That the combination of forces which the working class has already effected by its economical struggle ought to be at the same time serve as the lever for its struggle against the political power of landlords and capitalists. The conference recalls to the members of the International that in the militant state of the working class, its economical movement and its political action are indissolubly united. Also, the creation of the First International, just as the second, both products of the proletarian struggle, was also the attempt to prevent the movement from falling into the hands of anarchists and reformists. The Third International, too, was established in the midst of revolutionary struggle. To understand this, one must envisage 2 points. 1. The link between the organization party and the program party. 2. What situations and movements favor the founding of the party. 1. Marx specified these elements in his letter to Vielgraf. Let me state to begin with that the League had been dissolved at my instance in November 1852. I never again belonged, and do not now belong, to any secret or public society, that therefore the party, in this wholly ephemeral sense, ceased to exist for me 8 years ago. That is, the party as a group of people, organization, the link with point 2, takes place through the intermediary of this question. Why dissolve this organization? Marx replied by explaining that this is a phase of retreat, a counter-revolutionary phase. We ought to link this reply organically to the statement at Naples, meaning on Marxism as theory of the counter-revolution and on the capitalist revolutionary nature of Russia. In the second study, we state that our movement had already known other periods of counter-revolution. Thus, we should not make the Russian question central to our activities, as this would sooner or later result in a contingent vision. In these periods of the party is reduced to those comrades who have, in one way or another, refused the victory of the enemy class, which many militants theorize in wishing to break from the situation by doing something at any price. History, for Marx and Engels, was only the continued transformation of human nature. A period of retreat cannot create good militants. Those remaining have to be protected from this world's corruption, which is not easy. Can one escape dirt in ordinary bourgeois intercourse or trade? Precisely there it has its natural abode. The villainous honesty of solvent morality. I do not set one iota higher than the irrespectable villainy by which neither the First Christian Community, nor the Jacobin Club, nor erstwhile League was entirely unbesmirched. The only thing is that in bourgeois intercourse, one becomes accustomed to being dead to all sense of respectable villainy or villainous respectability. No utopia about man, so no activism, cordon sanitaire around the party was as clarified in as sol filo del tempo. This retreats from action. The thought out will to refuse action on the bourgeois field when that of the autonomous proletariat is no longer possible caused Marx to be, quote, several times bitterly attacked, if not by the name, then by the clear illusion for this, quote, inactivity. As we have frequently stated, music of the counter-revolution, words of yesterday, today is the same. Our, quote, activity is attacked because we refuse to leap into the whirlpool of bourgeois corruption. Our action is incomprehensible to them. Why the party never disappeared. Marx specified the life of the party after stating this. The League, like the Société des Saisons in Paris, and like 100 other societies, was only an episode in the history of the party, which is growing everywhere, spontaneously, from the soil of modern society. The formation of the organization is a product of the antagonisms of this society. If the class has been beaten, if its organs of struggle has lost its revolutionary character by rejecting the program, or if it has been destroyed during an armed struggle, a new organization will reappear spontaneously. The social contracts will lead to an explosion on the historical scene. The party will reappear. The party is not just this differential notion, then. This organization whose life somehow depends on the class struggle. What is the integral notion? I have also tried to clear up a misunderstanding that when I refer to the party, I mean an organization which died 8 years ago, or an editorial board which broke up 12 years ago. When I refer to the party, I do so in a historical sense, i.e., the prefiguration of future society, prefiguration of future man, the human being which is the real Gemenweisen of man. It is the attachment to this being which appears to be negated in the periods of counter-revolution, just as the revolution now seems to be a utopia to everyone that allows us to resist. The struggle to remain in this position is our activity. Marx said at the Central Committee meeting of the Communist League, Shrapner has misunderstood my motion. As soon as the motion is accepted, we will separate the two districts will separate, and the people involved will have no further connection with each other. They will be in the same league, however, and under the same central committee. You will even retain the great mass of the league members. As personal sacrifices are concerned, I have made many as anyone else, but they have been for the class and not for the individual people. As for enthusiasm, there is not so much enthusiasm involved in belonging to a party which you believe will become the government. I have always resisted the movementary opinion of the proletariat. We are devoted to a party which will do best not to assume power just now. Louis Blanc provided the best example of what happens when power is assumed prematurely. More generally, this question is linked to that of knowing under what conditions one can undertake an action. What is the link between this and consciousness? We shall elaborate on this, but first, let us remark that the act of uselessly dissipating energy in periods of retreat, mortgaging the historical encounter between the proletarian organization and its integral program. Such events are, however, maturing in Russia, where the vanguard of the revolution will engage in battle. This and its inevitable impact on Germany is what one must, in our opinion, wait for. And then will come in times of a grand demonstration and the establishment of an official formal international, which simply can no longer be a mere propaganda society, but only a society for action. We are therefore decidedly of the opinion that such an excellent means of combat should not be weakened by wearing it away and using it up at a time when things are comparatively quiet, when we are only on the even of the revolution. All Marxists agree on this last point. One will last recall Lenin and Bolshevik party struggle, that of Trotsky, and the whole work of the left to clarify that for us, insurrection is an art. What occurs in periods of revolution, as in those of retreat, in the continuity of our being, the affirmation of our program party in its historical sense. Rejection of anarchism to save the program. Marx and Engels struggled in the IWMA to make the program, not their personal ideology, the narrow vision of the anarchists and all our enemies, victorious. The sticking point was not the final vision. Everyone wanted communism, even the bourgeoisie, Lenin on this, but on the means for attaining it, on the tool for the liberation, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The support for this characterizes Marx's letter to Unreadable. Let us recall the movement, the class acts, only when it constitutes itself in the party, representing its interest, and thus, owing to its class characteristic, those of all humanity. The party seizes power, destroys the bourgeois state, sets itself up as a ruling class, thus as a state which is now no longer has a political but a social function, hence arriving at the future human nature, which is the real genuinizing of man. The destruction of classes is the condition sine qua non. This was the basic rub with Bakunin. We read in Article 2, the Alliance, desires above all the political, economic, and social equalization of classes. The equalization of classes, if taken literally, amounts to the harmony between capital and labor, which is precisely what bourgeois socialists so fortunately preach. It is not the equalization of classes, a logical impossibility, and therefore incapable of achievement, but on the contrary, the abolition of classes, which is the true secret of the proletarian movement, and the prime object of the International Workingmen's Association. The secret is maintained in the party, which is the dissolution of all enigmas, thus all antagonisms engendered in class society. The Circle of Jura Federation states that according to the statutes and the decisions of the founding Congress, the International is nothing other than a free federation of autonomous, self-continuing sections, and the emancipation of the workers is their own task, without any legal authority, even resulting from free consent. According to the General Council, would only be a mere statistical and corresponding bureau. This original foundation would rapidly be falsified, but a right given to the General Council to strengthen itself with the help of new members, and more still by the Basel Congress resolution, which gave the General Council the right to suspend any section until the next Congress, and to regulate provisionally the disputes until the pronouncement of the Congress. Thus, one would not have given the General Council a dangerous power. The free union of autonomous sections would be transformed into a hierarchical and authoritarian organization of disciplined sections, so much so that the sections would be entirely in the hands of the General Council, which could refuse at will admission and suspend their activities. To us German readers, who know only too well the value of an organization able to defend itself, all this will seem very startling, but the struggle for the emancipation of the working class is for Bakunin and his associates merely subterfuge. The true object is completely different. The future society must be none other than the generalization of the organization which the International will assume. We must thus be anxious for this organization to approach our ideal as far as possible. The International, the seed of the future human society, must from now on be a faithful copy of our principles of liberty and federation, and must thrust from its ranks any principle tending to the dictatorship and authority. We Germans are decried for our mysticism, but we are very far from attaining such mysticism. The International, a model for future society, with no more Versailles firing squads, military courts, permanent armies, interceptions and letters, bronze and criminal trials. Just now, when we have to fight for our own skin with tooth and nail, the proletariat must not organize for the necessities of the struggle, which is imposed on it every hour and every day, but according to it that some ghosts make of a vague future society. Let us depict what will become of our German organization if we were to organize according to this model. If Steiber and all his associates, if the entire Black Cabinet, if on command Prussian officers, entered the Social Democratic Organization so as to destroy it, the committee, or rather, the Statistical and Correspondence Bureau must absolutely not defend itself, for that would be to introduce a hierarchical and authoritarian society, and most of all, no disciplined section. Yes, no party discipline, no centralization of focus. In a word, no arms with which to fight. In short, we will go with such an organization, to the lax and rampant organization of the first Christians, to the slaves who accept with thanks each kick, and who through salary it is through furnished victory to their religion 3 centuries later. This is a method of revolution that the proletariat will certainly not imitate. I wasn't going to make any comments on this piece, but I'm kind of confused how the author of this is going to reconcile what Marx just said with everything else he's saying, because it seems to contradict most of it to me, honestly. Because, like, isn't Camatte's point that the party is the, substance of the future society? But this is Marx saying that, no, not really. There's not actually any reason to, like, work backwards from the party to emulate, what we imagine communism might look like. Which is why he doesn't really go into detail about that either, really. So yeah, I don't know how this is, what Marx just said's compatible with the politics of the author, but I guess we'll see. The different phases in the life of the party. We can now specify the life of the party. 1. Phase of sex. 2. Development of the party in 1840 to 8. 3. Period of retreat beginning in 1850. It was preferable to dissolve the League because of what we have just said, and because the moment of the party to seize power had not yet then arrived. The class had been beaten. If then we had been beaten, we have nothing else to do but to begin again from the beginning. Unfortunately, the probably very short interval of rest, which had allowed us between the close of the first and the beginning of the second act of the movement, gives us time for a very necessary piece of work. The study of the causes that necessitated both the latter outbreak and its defeat, causes that are not yet to be sought for in the accidental efforts, talents, faults, errors, and treacheries of some of the leaders, but in the general social state and the condition of existence of each of the convulsed nations. This is also true for the involution that manifested itself from 1926. Hence, Trotsky's error in believing that one could reconstruct an international. This involution revealed us all the errors revealed by Engels. Instead of a logical study in a balance sheet which would have allowed for the preparation for another revolutionary rise, one tried to find the cause of the defeat in the betrayals of the leaders. Stalin's crimes, the passivity of the masses, the anchor application of slogans. This is Trotsky's criticism of German movement of the 1930s. Only we pose the problem correctly, and we state that we have been beaten. But, 4. Reconstruction of the movement, which accelerated with the 1857 crises. Marx and Engels studied fundamentally the reasons for the defeat. Their leaving the League did not mean their acceptance of the defeat. On the contrary, they tried to find out if the revolution could not break out elsewhere, in India or China, and come to radicalize the proletarian struggle in the West. Lenin held the same position, which is also ours. 1864, the foundation of the International Working Men's Association, which took place in the period of rising of the proletarian movement. Only conditions were not altogether favorable. However, the proletariat tended to supersede sectarianism and support this international organization. Also, there was the anarchist danger, for if the movement were to be taken over by anarchists, it would run the risk of simply being reduced to lower types of struggle. This is why Marx and Engels believed the foundation of the IWMA to be necessary. 1871, the proletariat took power. The characteristics of the commune will be analyzed in the study of the French workers' movement and on the military question. In any case, the class was beaten internationally. In the new period after 1871, as in after 1850, action was above all theoretical work. In 1851, Engels wrote to Marx, "What use will be the entire gossip and drivel of the whole of the emigre rabble made at your expense when you reply to it with your economy?" On November 24th, 1871, Marx wrote to De Pape, "I have already told you in London that I have often asked myself whether the time has come for me to withdraw from the General Council. The more the association develops, the more time is lost, and finally I do have to complete capital once and for all." The workers had to be given their means of struggle. 5. Marx drew up a fresh balance sheet in 1871 and specified the conditions for struggle. He specified the link between human will and action, that the party program was produced at a given moment of the human struggle, that the proletarian organization could only develop with a certain level of class struggle, i.e., the class had to gain its program. Put another way, the party does not form by the direct will of men. It is recreated in determinate periods. It was a matter of knowing how the revolutionaries could prepare the best conditions for the return of the party onto the stage of history. All this was explained in Marx's speech on September 25, 1871. The great success which he had hitherto crowned the IWMA's efforts due to the circumstances over which the members themselves had no control. The foundation of the International itself was the result of these circumstances, and by no means due to the effects of the men engaged in it. It was not the work of any set of clever politicians. All the politicians in the world could not have created the situation and circumstances requisite for the success of the International. The International had not put forth any particular creed. Its task was to organize the forces of labor and link the various working men's movements and combine them. The circumstances, which had given such great development to the association, were the conditions under which the work people were more and more oppressed throughout the world. And it was through the secret of success. But before such a change, socialism could be effected, a proletarian dictature would become necessary, and the first condition of that was the proletarian army. The working class would have to conquer the right to emancipate themselves on the battlefield. The task of the International was to organize and combine the forces of labor for the coming struggle. 6. 1871 to 89, the period of the reconstruction of the movement which ended in the foundation of the Secondary International, which was a little forced. Actually, it was supported above all by the possibilities of various reformists. Engels accepted its foundation to prevent the world movement from falling into their hands. The program underwent practical proof in 1889 and was reinforced. The Commune of 1871 had allowed the specification of the theory of the state. The cycle of the proletarian movement was thus terminated. No social phenomena could again question Marx. There remained only the hypotheses of a non-catastrophic evolution of society, thus of a peaceful revolution. In the 1914 war showed the absurdity of all that. The reformist vision could only be imposed because of the development of imperialism, which created contradictions after a while from the colonized countries. Only the groups remaining on the basis of the international program assured the continuity of the human being equals the party program. The last counter-revolutionary storm. Tactical errors prevented the proletariat's reorganization as the World Communist Party. There were the terrors of the United Front and the two force of a vision, which prevented the Russian proletariat from receiving the aid of the world proletariat. This tactic somehow recognized the defeat of the Western proletariat and theorized it. The theory of the counter-revolution grafted itself onto these errors. Here we reach the most difficult, longest, and most painful stage of the development of the workers' movement. The counter-revolution triumphed in the guise of revolution. To be able to get back to the latter, it was insufficient to get onto the field of the Russian leaders. One cannot consider the Russian question to be central. The validity of Marxism in no way depends on the success or failure of the Russian Revolution, because Marxism had been shown to be correct in each of its parts. Thus, success of the Russian Revolution depended solely on the worldwide victory of the proletariat. Now, as has been shown many times, the victory of socialism in Russia depended on the seizure of power by the proletariat in the West. If there has been to be a verification, one must find it in our Western zone. The continuity was not destroyed. The left defended the program. It showed the facts of it in their purity on all their levels, theoretical, practical, tactical. Better still, it made a new stromation of all the separated elements of Marxism, which had not been ordered organically after the new struggle, in an ensemble of theses which did not pretend to have discerned something new, but had ordered things for a more effective struggle. These were the Rome theses and the Lyon theses, and all the works of on the party. The proletariat abandons its program in periods of defeat. The program is only defended by a weak minority. Only the program party always emerges, reinforced by the struggle. The struggle from 1926 to today proves that fully. This struggle takes place with providing evidence and demasking critically far greater than that the Russians were led to do practically. It consists in showing how they were led to create new categories to include reality in their general positions. We know that the basis, far the foundation of the World Communist Party, will only exist after the critical demasking is over. The recognition. We alone also know that the proletariat has to draw this out and struggle. It will thus rediscover its program, which is presently denatured and prostituted. We can show our task by this following comparison. Jesus chased the moneylenders out of the temple, and we must chase away all those who sell their theoretical goods, calling them Marxism. So yet again, invariance, i.e. the continuity of our human nature, is the party program. It is only by so envisaging the party that one can integrate the apparent opposition between the act of proclaiming the possibility of communist revolution in 1848 and starting in 1859, which was already done differently in the German ideology, that all the social forms only disappear when they've exhausted their possibilities. The communist revolution can shorten the transitory capitalist phase from the moment where there is a development of the productive forces that engenders a class able to appropriate the human nature. Henceforth, communism is only possible, laying it is not to delude oneself on the capacity for the ruling class to resist, which can still realize something which hinders the liberation movement, because it provokes the rise of opportunism in the proletariat. Marx and Engels could prepare the troops for retreat after the defeat by realizing all that. After other moments, throw all their forces into battle and are completely destroyed. It is this dialectical vision that gave birth to our historical continuity, on the fact that may be called the anti-fatalism and anti-activism of the Leon Theses of 1926. In any case, now we have arrived at the point indicated by Marx, where the social form had exhausted all its possibilities, at least for a large part of the world. We greet with joy the great movement of expropriation, which develops on a worldwide scale, because the greater it grows, the greater the possibility of reappropriation of the human nature, the more real communism is. Function of the party form. The function of the party derives from the struggle in contemporary society and from the description of communist society. First, the organization of workers, organization of force, and use of violence. The political movement of the working class has as its ultimate object, of course, the conquest of political power for this class, and this naturally requires a previous organization of the working class developed up to a certain point and arising precisely from its economic struggles. On the other hand, however, every movement in which the working class comes out as a class against the ruling classes and tries to coerce them by pressure from without is a political movement. For instance, the attempt in a particular factory, or when in a particular trade, to force a shorter working day out of individual capitalists by strikes, etc., is a purely economic movement. On the other hand, the movement to force through an 8-hour workday, etc., is a political movement, and in this way, out of the separate economic movements of the workers, there grows up everywhere a political movement, that is to say, a movement of the class with the object of enforcing its interests in a general form, in a form possessing general, socially coercive force. While these movements presuppose a certain degree of previous organization, they are in turn equally a means for developing this organization. Where the working class is not yet far enough advanced in its organization to undertake a decisive campaign against the collective power, i.e. the political power of the ruling class, it must at any rate be trained, for this by continual agitation against this power, and by a hostile attitude towards the policies of the ruling classes. Otherwise, it remains a plaything in their hands. The party thus allows for the organization of the class. After, it will become the subject of the dictatorship of the proletariat. 1. The aims of the association is the overthrow of all previous classes, and their subjugation to the dictatorship of the proletariat, which will carry through the permanent revolution until the realization of communism, the ultimate form of organization of the human family. 2. Towards the realization of this goal, the association will form a bond of solidarity between all tendencies of the Revolutionary Communist Party, while in accordance with the principle of Republican brotherhood. It dispenses with all normal restrictions. It is this dictatorship which allows the destruction of the bourgeois state and which impels the social formation. The dictatorship is a historically necessary and thus free. Here we have to say that we are not just for any dictatorship, and that this dictatorship is a means. We have to see against whom the dictatorship must be enforced, against which, in whose and what name, one can say this point of view, that only the reactionary dictatorship, which wishes to maintain a class oppression, are authoritarian because they are rejected by man, being unnecessary to his development, and because they absorb the Gemenweisen to exploit it. The revolutionary dictatorship is not authoritarian because it is accepted by man as liberation, while this new Gemenweisen will have an increasing tendency to identify itself with the human existence, and so disappears as a phenomena outside people. Lenin said that the dictatorship of the proletariat was that of the immense majority over the minority, unlike that of the bourgeois class. Marx also showed in Capital that the latter also becomes ever more the dictatorship of capital, thus itself developing outside the class. During the revolutionary period, in fact, the revolutionary power of the bourgeoisie allowed the development of production by the destruction of bonds linked with the existence of feudal society. Therefore, capital and the capitalist are identical to begin with, and the freedom of one reflects on the freedom of the other. Afterwards, with the capitalist concentration together, with the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, the capitalist can separate from this his having, and he, who was capital's being, becomes its property. The capitalist as person disappears. If the crisis demonstrates the incapacity for the bourgeois for managing any modern productive force, the transformation of the great establishments for production and distribution into joint stock companies, trusts, and state property shows how unnecessary the bourgeoisie are for that purpose. All social functions of the capitalist are now performed by salaried employees. Freedom disappears, or, more in the case, it is merely that of capital. This becomes an impersonal force, served by a bureaucracy, pathology of classes, which becomes the organization of the modern state. Put another way, the state becomes state capital, with its bureaucratic administration. All the individuals in the society participate in capital. They receive a profit in proportion to what they invested. The modern state has to make this operation, this equalization, respected. Hence the crying contradiction of our epoch, an ever more oppressive state, and the demands by individuals for it to be even stronger. The last French crisis, linked to the Algerian War, was the nth demonstration of this. The bourgeois dictatorship has become a monstrous form alien to man, hindered by the development of society, which, as a whole, tend towards communism. Capitalism itself tends to disappear. The proletariat has a struggle against this dictatorship. The destruction of the latter is the suppression of sickness of men. The installation of the dictatorship of the proletariat is its recognition by the appropriation of human nature. Thus, the antitheses individual state, individual species, liberty, authority, necessity are dissolved. The dictatorship of the proletariat was suggested by Marx, by the events of the bourgeois revolution, by Babeuf, the struggles of the French proletariat in its specific blankest form, not to forget Flora Tristan, by that of the English and German workers. The workers expressed practically the theoretical need formulated by Marx in his critique of Hegel. Might is right. They reject all forms of struggle and aspire to a kind of power which would allow the foundation of a classless society. It is important to note that Marx always based himself on reality to establish his theory. The same process of the question of the state in the lessons of the Commune. From this flowed A. The party is a minority of the class. B. Unification of the proletariat internationally to take power. International character of the revolution and of communism. The importance of communism is not that it is a highly serious question of the time for France and England. Communism has a European importance. The party has to unite the struggle and make it lose its limited character. C. The class struggle is a war, so an army is needed. There is therefore the question of neutralizing certain social layers, the question of allies. One has to establish a base for regrowth in case of defeat. We have, as Marx underlined several times, an ardent passion for man and his liberation, but it is not for that reason we shall throw ourselves into the struggle. We must always try to dominate the strategy and terrain of struggle. Our enemy will be assured sooner or later of the maintenance of order in an opposite case. For us, the insurrection is an art. Characteristic of the party of tomorrow. Given that the party is the prefiguration of communist society, it cannot adopt a mechanism, a life, a principle, an organization linked to bourgeois society. It has to realize the destruction of the society. 1. Refusal of the democratic mechanism. Our position is organic centralism. 2. Anti-individualism. The party realizes the anticipation of the social brain. All knowledge is mediated by the party, as is all action. The militant does not have to seek the truth. This is afforded to him by the party. Truth in the social domain. In other fields, one can come at it after the revolution and only then. Tendency to rise social man. 3. Refusal of any form of mercantilism and careerism. The relationship between comrades, their manifestation, must be inspired by the comments by Marx on James Mill's book. All activity, all manifestations, must be the affirmation of human joy by communication with other and hero with future society. 4. Abolition of social antagonism linked to classes. There are only communist militants in the party. Practically, this means the unity of the party around place of living and not place of work. The party itself has to be the solution of the enigmas and must know itself to be so. It must present itself as the harbor for the proletarian. The place he affirms his human nature so that he is able to mobilize all his strength against the class enemy. One must speak these characteristics because they make clear the party's function. They allow one to have an integral view of it. The party, in this impersonal form above generations, it represents the human species, the human existence, which has finally been found. It's the consciousness of the species. It can only manifest itself under certain conditions. In a revolutionary situation, there can only be the overturning of praxis, which is the overthrow of all past and present human development. The party decides to seize power. The destruction of bourgeois society ends human prehistory. Then everything converges. It is the culminating point of the theory by the exact prediction of the favorable moment for action. Insurrection is an art. The two phenomena are summed up. It is the consciousness of action, which appeared consciousness before action. Marxism is a theory of human action, a theory of the production of consciousness, so it is also a reflection on the action, on this praxis, so it is consciousness of this action. It is thus produced consciousness. It is the absolute truth of this consciousness. Consequently, we can say that it is a guide to action because it is the organical action of the proletariat, subject of history. A guide to human action leading to the liberation of man, towards his consciousness, towards common society. It is the guide to human emancipation. Postface, January 1974. From the party community to the human community. This text was published in 1961 as a report of the internationalist groups in France and was not the contribution of party militants because at the time, the small organization originating in what is called the Italian left did not really see itself as a party on an international scale. In fact, the text was the work of two people, myself and Roger Dangerfield. It is an example of what Bordiga called a semi-finished work because it had not been fully edited. Originally, it was to have been an exposé for the Rome March 1961 meeting. Since I wasn't able to be there, I wrote a text, but lacking the time, I resorted to a condensed presentation of some points, often only listed, to give an impression of the work's totality. Due to its numerous aims, this text could only be dense and sometimes involved, often laconic, because I wished to deal with the question of party in specifying its different moments, and especially to define the future party as it could be, which was connected with the idea, to be demonstrated, that the party arose spontaneously, thus trying to supersede the spontaneity consciousness opposition, and above all, that of consciousness coming from outside and immanent consciousness, often reduced to spontaneity. To present the left in its originality, to divide it from Leninism and Trotskyism, to make it a real break with the Third International, to lay the foundation of the anti-immediatism and anti-activism of the left, to augment the invariance of the theory of the proletariat, and to approach the analysis of what I consider to be the fundamental relation, that of the Gemeinwesen in the human being, être humain. It was Bordiga who wanted the text published. Once it had been printed, even its imperfect, elliptic, and sometimes defective style, the die was cast. One no longer needed to envisage its modification, but to consider the investigation that it contained. One had to go on from the sketches to exhaustive explanations. This could not happen through the party, because in fact the text gave rise to an intense opposition inside the current of the left. The attempt to impose it were met only with a feeble echo, but it existed, which allowed a supersession of the whole question of the party. Thus, there was a meeting in Marsville in the end of 1962 with a section dealing with the three internationals. It was hoped to clarify historically that the life of the party and the class as had been sketched in the origin and function. This did not occur and did not supersede the level of generalities. The essential arguments developed during this meeting were published in Invariance Series 1 No. 6, La Révolution Communiste. Les causes de l'histoire du mouvement prolétarien. The work on the democratic mystification began in 1962 and was approached at various party meetings. From then on, it was also in the same perspective. Again, there was but a weak echo. Only a few, including Bordiga, agreed that the job should be done. The Thesis in Invariance, Series No. 1, provides the essentials of this work. The schemes are Bordiga, but not the commentaries underneath them. He's referring to the democratic mystification. Yet, we did not define an important passage written in 1964, commenting on Marx's contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, a preparatory work for the study of democracy. We do so here because it illustrates well our position then inside the organization. All other state forms are definite, distinct, particular forms of state. In democracy, the formal principle is at the same time the material principle. Only democracy, therefore, is the true unity of the general and the particular. For there to be democracy on a large base, men have to be on an egalitarian basis. They must be reduced to approximately the same substance. The human species is unified by the action of capital, but still object and not subject, hence the bourgeois limit to historical social development. The democracy form of organization can only be useful for humanity reaching this stage. Humanity, tending to its unification, can still have an external being, as a prisoner alienated to an economic form. The society tending to give it a real being, communism, cannot be democratic. Unification movement is constructed to the profit of an oppressive being. The oppressive moment at the beginning of the domination of capital still did not envisage itself because capital did not dominate in a real manner, but it had to assure its hegemony, above all against the proletariat. Consequently, it is the first aspect that matters. Hence the utopian's illusion, then those of the reformist. In democracy, the state as particular is merely particular. As general, it is truly general, i.e. not something determinate in distinction from the other content. This fully verified in present-day society. It is the limit. The state is the universal concrete. It is society because society has conquered the state. It models the state in its image. Here again, the limit bourgeois society tends to destroy classes to make men slaves of capital. It tends to do the same as communism, only the latter has the vanishing classes as supposing the sovereignty of man, the domination of the German-Weisen. The capital state can thus be the universal being, not of men, but of capital slaves. It is no longer true for the whole, but for the basis. The question of the link between the state and society is mutatis mutandis, that of the link of the party and the class, and later, the whole of humanity. Capitalism tends to resolve the question by making the state a social force, society alien to capital, which dominates men. We therefore have to specify this movement of unification, which supposes the parallel of the concentration of consciousness, thus also the corollary, the question of the link between the united masses and the consciousness, between the class and its social brain. The party. That is the great question asked by the philosophers, especially Hegel, who posted clearly and plainly in this philosophy of the state. There is the beginning of the reconciliation between the social and the political in bourgeois society. Beforehand, it seemed that the political movement was independent of the other. Force still appeared to be an individual and not a social and economic fact. That is what Proudhon did not understand. His theory of violence was only one of physical violence, as it could have been in primitive society. The strongest man could really dominate it. Now, who can attack the system physically? It is the phenomena of equalization which is fundamental. We are all kids faced with the impersonal power of capital. All the powers have been subjugated under a single one. Economic forces. Politics as an element, seemingly autonomous in function, was also subjugated. That is the case with war. Men cannot wage wars as in Napoleon's time. Capital, in its metamorphosizing engine of iron and steel, imposes a given form of destruction, and outside the fundamental consideration that before one waged war for enrichment, now for impoverishment, to restart the productive machine at full tilt, machines and men produced in mad quantities had to be destroyed. So, the characterization of the state, when bourgeois society emerged from feudal society, is completely true. First, Marx makes the following remark. In democracy, the constitution, the law, the state itself, insofar as it is politically constitution, is only the self-determination of the people and the particular content of the people. In the states of antiquity, the political state makes up the content of the state to the exclusion of the other spheres. The modern state is a compromise between the political and unpolitical state. This is a fundamental characteristic of a society where the capital dominates formally, a period where it tends to use its political power to ensure its domination, to make it a social domination. The bourgeois revolution is a social revolution with a political aim. It also tends to assure its political domination by a social force. It is simultaneously the end of politics. The question of the relationship between men, their organization, and domination is resolved by an external being, capital. So far as capital has not yet assured its material and real domination, there is an arrangement between the political and non-political states. There is also an arrangement between form and matter. Hence what seems paradoxical, democracy, which ought to be realized for man, is realized by excluding man. This inevitably happens while democracy supports a domination, a dictatorship, and a base as large as possible. At the same time, the study of the philosophical question tended to deal with the same theme, but differently. The following statement show this amply. Philosophy appeared when primitive communism dissolved, so at the moment where the German-Weisen was secured by a class state. Philosophy is the theoretical attempt to reconcile antagonistic forces of the old society. The most obvious proof of the non-acceptance of those forms, various analysis, all having the central point of the rejection of democracy and the affirmation of the need for a new community, lay in the debate on organization, which became very acute in 1964. Then, some comrades, some of whom later published Révolution Communiste, but also applies for a small group publishing Octobre Rousseau, believed that the party ought to intervene mere actively in the struggles which since 1962 in Italy had attained a certain importance. They saw the cause of the incapacity of the party to intervene in those struggles in its way of life, its organization. That is why they opposed the abandonment of organic centralism, actively support this since 1952, and its replacement with democratic centralism, and they preached anew what is to be done. Bordiga reacted strongly against this tendency and published notes for the theses on the organization question. These were accompanied by texts elaborating the definitive theses, fundamental texts suitable for showing the invariance of a position entitled Contribution to Our Present Post-War Moment to the Organization Question. Origin and function was included among them in sections why the party never disappeared and the basis of the future party were reproduced. This meant that Bordiga still agreed with the text and implied that the comrades trying to continue the task undertaken with him were to carry out their researches. This is why I wrote to Bordiga in a letter dated 27/12/64. The relation between the party and the community is also the question of the material community created by capital, as well as that of the mistake of the French bourgeois revolutionaries who wished to found a new community, while capital was founding its own, with its own development, will be studied later in the work of the workers' movement. Only this aspect of the question is linked to the study of Capital, Chapter 6, above all, and Marx's famous year text, where he dealt with this question. The consideration followed of the party-individual relation and the critique of the affirmation of the negation of the individual ending finally in the negation of the human being himself. The allusion to the material community of capital is explained in the fact that the study of the 6th chapter of Capital was undertaken at the same time. It was due to this study that the explanation of the development of the community assumed a more adequate basis. In a letter dated 11/5/64, sent to Dangeville and Bordiga, I raise these points. The meaning of the demonstration is this: when the human communities are destroyed by the action of the economic forces, use value loses its importance. Usefulness of the product disappeared to be replaced by exchange value. Production was for man in primitive society after it was for wealth. The movement of the expropriation of man and his separation from the Gemeinwesen is accompanied by the increasing autonomization of exchange value. Here, Marx analyzed the passage to capital as a passage to the complete autonomization of exchange value. Money, which results in autonomizes itself from circulation, which perpetuates and valorizes, reproduces itself, is capital. Money has lost its fixedness in capital and has become a process from being a palpable thing. Marx also showed how capital became an impersonal being. It is also important to note that Capital Volume 2 begins with the metamorphoses of capital. It is no longer a matter of the commodity circulation process, which is formal. It is a question of the metamorphosis of the same being. Then he indicates that capital is a result of a long process, and he makes the essential remark: one sees as the determined point in which way the dialectical form of exposition is correct only if one knows its limitation. That is, one has to know its pre-capitalist forms of production in communism. Thus, Marx described communism, and more immediately, the ultimate forms of capitalism. It is just these forms that we shall try to evidence in trying to see how commodity capital presents itself. Capital absorbs the real non-capitalist labor. To do this, this labor has to lose its concrete character. It uses value for man and becomes use value for capital. All human labor has thus to become abstract. Here we find again in another form what Marx said in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of the state. Capital is the negation of value because it is its own affirmation. It is its valorization, its reproduction of an ever-increasing scale. It is the negation of value, but the affirmation of value that has achieved autonomy. Capital, a value which is no longer linked to whatever use. It is not valorization, and so the only use value interested for capital is labor. But here again, labor has lost its character as use value for man. It is for capital, in the same order of ideas, the 1844 manuscript, where Marx explains what labor under the rule of capital is: wage labor. Thus, labor is originally an activity of man allowing him to exploit the land. All the later social forms interpose an intermediary between land and man. Capital does more. It makes man a source of wealth. It inverts the phenomena. Man is the ancient land from which all products necessary for life are taken. Capital draws life from them, exploits it just as man exploits an iron ore mine. This is therefore as appearance of an impersonal being that capital originates. They, individuals, do not have any relation between themselves from the point of view of organic social metabolism, which develops in circulation without this objective mediation, i.e. commodities. This exists solely as reified, one for the other, something which is finally developed solely in the money relation, where the common being, Jim and Wisen, appears as an external and so accidental thing above everyone. The fact that the social ensemble, which appears through the clash of independent individuals, at the same time as a material necessity and as an external bond to them, it represents exactly their independence for which social existence is so a necessity, but is only a means to appear to the individuals themselves as something external, and money as something palpable. And as much as they are not subsumed in the capital community, nor on the other hand consciously subsume elements of a community under them, this must be by comparison with them, by comparison with independent subjects, as something reified, likewise independent, external, and accidental. This is just a condition that they, as private independent persons, remain at the same time in a social ensemble. Now, this is what I believe can be deduced from the passage. The human community is destroyed by the action of private property, exchange, division, and labor in simple circulation. But simple circulation cannot lead to the reconstruction of a material community, because there is no liberation of man, no separation from his immediate community mediated by land, feudal hierarchy, or even by money. Man has to be circulated as commodity, labor power, for there to be the birth of autonomous exchange value, capital, which would be able to presuppose the whole of the social phenomenon. Capital becomes the material, German-Weisen, of man, but an enslaved abstract man. See, in parallel, a critique of Hegel's philosophy of the state. I'm a little confused here, because Marx seems to be describing capital as something that destroys the human community. But earlier, Camatte describes communism as the domination of the human community. But wouldn't... Well, and also, I thought the human community always existed. But Marx seems to be saying that capital destroys it. So, I thought we have 2 or 3 different contradictory sentiments that are being used together, all to explain the concept of German Weisen, which is never actually really explained in this whole piece. I think it just means human community. I don't know. It seems like a pretty confusing topic, and this really doesn't do much to elucidate it. Hence the mystification of abstract communities, which also negates the economic movements in any case, as they draw the limits of the realization of these communities, and perhaps the society, and especially during the early period of capitalism, period of formal domination. The question of democracy ought to be seen in this way, recreating a human community while the economic movements and forces has been liberated from the bourgeois revolution and could but tend to install the community of capital. Seen in this way, Marx's polemic with Rouge assumes a further dimension. One also sees why Marx was so interested in the prior forms, in the analysis of the division of labor in primitive communism, in the forms of its dissolution, in the period of simple commodity circulation, and finally in capitalist society. Hence the role of politics in the whole period of from primitive communism to developed capitalism, real domination. Politics was the attempt to unify men separated by the productive forces. Now the same men are reunited as the domination of capital. So politics is used by capital to dominate men. Hence the contradiction that emerges with the use of forms that were useful but which are now no longer adequate, which also means that bourgeois society is based on a misunderstanding, a lie which has its source in the very roots of this society. In my letter dated 26/5/64 to the same people, I made the following remarks. Thus, in pre-capitalist, mercantilist society, the law of value is necessary when it is a question of producing commodities. Under capitalism, it is not a question of producing commodities, but of valorizing a value, increasing it. Thus, it becomes process. Everything is in motion. I thought that's the whole point of commodities, though, so this is kind of a confusing way to word that. That is why pre-capitalist society can make do with metaphysics, while capitalism engenders the dialectic. The same themes were always underlined, as too with the expos of the French workers' movement at the Marcel's meeting, but this encountered the same opposition, more often passive than active. The account of the meeting was only published in French in 1971 in Invariants, Series 10. Series 1, Number 10. Let us return to the question of the party to the state, that at the same time, the formal party was seen as having to be the party community. What the hell? What, the party community? I.e., the definition, it could only be a realization of the historical needs which was defined as being that of the proletariat realizing the human community. Put another way, the distinction between historical and formal party ought to have tended to lose all meaning, but such a statement implies a rejection of all discussion, often lively ones, on the form of organization and the need for leaders in them. As forms of organization, Annie Price, on the other hand, saw the debate as a choice between formal and historical party. Hence the strange specification that Bordiga believed he had made in considerations on the party's organic activity when the general situation is historically unfavorable. That alone institutionalizing the difference between historical and formal party, and thus making any supersession impossible. One must say that there, since 1963, the same organization considered itself to be a party that really existed. Hence the expression organic activity of the party in a clear context. The specification was Thesis 12. The distinction existed in Marx and Engels, and they had the duty to infer from its disdain for belonging to any formal party, as they were, with their work, on the line of the historical party. Thus no militant today can however conclude that this he has the right to choose to be in line with the historical party and to ridicule the formal party. It is not that Marx and Engels were supermen of the type and race unlike all others, but one must understand that their proposition has a dialectical and historical meaning. Marx said the party is the historical meaning, in the historical sense, informal or ephemeral party. The first notion contains a continuity, and hence we derive our characteristic of the invariance of the party from the time Marx formulated it, not a genius invention, but as a result of human evolution. But the two concepts are not in metaphysical opposition, and it would be foolish to express it with a little catechism. Cold shoulder the formal party, and go instead for the historical one. When we deduce from the invariant doctrine the conclusion that the revolutionary victory of the working class can only be won with the class party and its dictatorship, and guided by Marx's work, we state that before the revolutionary and communist party, perhaps the proletariat was a class for bourgeois science, but not for Marx and us. The conclusion to be deduced from its victory requires a party deserving simultaneously the title of historical and formal party, i.e. the victory requires that the reality of action in history have resolved the apparent contradiction, and that it has dominated a long and difficult past between the historical party, thus as the content, historical invariant program, and contingent party, thus as to the form which acts as a force and physical practice of a decisive part of the proletariat struggle. The synthetic mise au point of the doctrinal question must also be applied to historical stages before their own. One can clearly see from the above text that the entire basis of the question was removed, and all that remained was by definition the justification for the existence of the small organization whose majority wished to be called a party at any price. At the beginning of 1963, when these theses were published, they succeeded. While before for Bordiga and always for us, the party could only be in a distant future. However, I approached the question again based on all the world indicated. Thus, I wrote in a letter to Bordiga dated 1865, accompanying the dispatch of a collection of commentaries on the works of young Marx. Marx found the solution in the Communist Gemeinwesen. He demonstrated the genesis of the state and so the destruction of the old community, and afterwards the reformation of the community. One can show that this was Marx's basic preoccupation. In fact, he discussed capital in 4 different ways. 1. In the 1844 manuscript, he insisted mainly on alienated labor, and so wage labor in capitalist society. 2. Contribution to the critique of political economy. He stated the material relation, the commodity, then capital. The conclusions were the same, only Marx wanted to show both how the social process was actually produced and how it occurred in men. The various economic schools, so a double plan, on one hand purely economic facts and historical considerations on the other. 3. Forms which precede capitalist production. In the first 2 texts, he tried to see how the wage labor had been produced, how capital constituted itself. The difference between the 2 works resulted from the different central points, the alienated wage labor and capital. Hence Marx explains that capital can only develop by destroying the natural community, then the one mediated by land, etc. The central point is the community. 4. The text, which is only a part of the draft of contribution. Here Marx posed the problem of the autonomization of exchange value and shows that gold cannot realize that, only capital could. Only, he also indicated that now capital can be the material community. Oh, okay, that's where there's an impasse. It alone could replace the old community destroyed during the various revolutions, which are the various periods of man's expropriation, up to the total rejection of man, even ejected from the production process and thus from labor's the proletariat. This is important because it completes the investigation of the forms, and moreover allows the unifying of the whole work on the fundamental question of the community, i.e. communism. On 21/6/65, I specified a simple addition to my last letter. The specification of the party community are vital for understanding the historical and formal party. The two are not opposites, nor have we interposed these two terms as to oppose them, but on the contrary, to interpose the historical continuity, to show that it was integral, while our enemies saw only the differentials. This is why prior to knowing Marxist terminology, we spoke of integral, or historical, and differential, or formal party. The party arises historically, i.e. integrally, because it expresses the totality of the communist program. But the class struggle made the party afterwards not always to succeed in supporting the whole of the program, and to allow itself to be limited to replies offered to situations posed by the class struggle while it had contingent tasks to accomplish. That was possible when there was still the possibility of progressive emancipation, but that is no longer so, now capitalism is fully developed. Thus the present party form can only be historical. Now this is the community, which is the prefiguration of communist society. Its essential task is to unite the working class, which will again be set in motion by the crisis of capital leading to the revolution. Afterwards, the party, reappropriation of human beings, will unify the species, abolition of classes. This is all in Marx's so-called philosophical works. Okay, now it makes more sense to me. The neo-Leninists and Trotskyists current dominated ever more from then on. Bordiga releases Ballast, even retreated, moaning that he abandoned the work tending to supersede the historical moment of leaving the old workers' movement, and so really fouling the originality of the Italian left. Thus, he no longer quoted Origin and Function. Among the texts forming the documentary material, showed and illustrated the comment on the general theses on Naples meeting and the Naples theses. A compromise between the two divergent positions? I don't understand. The little history is needed to show the accord one could have with Bordiga on the question of the party, as well as the limits. Origin and Function was a sort of key text, because many polemics revolved around it, all those leaving the PCI after 1962 attacked it violently. And because it was the start of a supersession, continued with the work published in Invariants, and also owing to the opposition it incited. It provoked the strengthening of the Leninist component with the worship of the link with the Third Internationalists by Bordiga, but especially the PCI, which fell completely into the Leninist current, and lost all its originality after 1966. It is also a key text because it supports the resistance to the counter-Belgian counter-revolution. The effective isolation, the famous cordon sanitaire, the workers' agitation, apart from the Belgian miners' strike of 1960, linked to the structural crises of Belgian capitalism, which was limited, did not assume greater depth until a few years later. But then it was no longer the classical proletariat manifesting itself, it also reflected the shakings linked to the anti-colonial revolution. It was in this appreciation of the historical moment that there was this divergence inside the PCI. Great effort is made in the text not to displace it contingently, but in the totality of the communist movement. Also, one tended to destroy any sectarian vision fixed on the small organization and trying to supersede it with the perspective of uniting all forces really future-oriented, so as to start the attack on the counter-revolution. Capital. Finally, this text appeared when the left tended to extend geographically, a bit thus posing acutely the relation with the perspective outlined in 1856 of a revolutionary moment about 1975. One had to think of the huge body of the class conceived historically as a unitary phenomenon, an attempt to supersede Marx's strictly limited position, but such an adoption of position also led to a critical view of the past, hence the divergence with those wishing to question nothing and to continue over time. This divergence could only be aggravated. The themes in Origin and Function were not exhausted in 1965, but in fact were taken up again in other works published in Invariants such as Perspectives. The Communist Revolution, they were taken up again in Chapter 8.5, the reunification of the class and the formation of the party community. One also has to specify the importance of the forecasts, but this did not happen because the critique of organization founded on the analysis of the May 1968 movement led to a questioning of the way of understanding the formation of the Communist Party. This was the letter of 4969, written with Gianna Kulu on Gangs Publishing in Invariants, Series 2, Number 2, with a preface called De-Organization. Origin and function cannot really be understood without a knowledge of the account of the meetings before 1962 published in Invariance Series 1, or which appeared in Bordiga et Passion du Communisme. What do you mean they can't be understood without reading other things? Come on. Those texts were unknown to the French public in 1968, and that's why we quoted them extensively when we published Invariance 1. We also used many quotations from Lenin with the polemical intention of showing they could not be reduced to what is to be done, and that he had a greater vision of the party phenomena. We only wanted to note his overgrowth and not to convey everything definitely superseded and realized. Now this is no more interest, so we prefer to publish the text as it appeared in Italian in 1961 with Bordiga subtitles. We said that Dangerville participated in the production of Origin and Function. The reader can see his evolution by reading the 4 volumes of Parti de Classe and Petite Collection Maspero. This has not been translated into English, so it's not happening. Finally, let's note that Rubel's text, Remarques sur le concept du parti prolétarien chez Marx, was a great source of inspiration. The various studies made since 1969, some which appeared in Invariance Series 2, have led to a total supersession of the classist position, and so too any theorizing about the party. This will be shown exhaustively in the future issue of the journal. Nevertheless, we had to take a position on this old text to show a development itself, clarifying the conceptions of which we have arrived. One saw in Origin and Function, as elsewhere in Bordiga's work after 1945, that the party is always the party as it has to be. Basically, the small group has to be under extreme tension to define something, and this could only happen with the mediation of the grasping of communist society. So as soon as an element was seen differently, everything had to be changed as the party was really envisaged through the totality. It is the same for the proletariat. It was postulated as it had to be through transhistoric consciousness determined by a historic process, or more exactly, according to a representation determined by a specific historical process. The party was conceived of always have to be produced in its purest form. The proletariat, the being always more the true proletariat, from Branus of 1793 through the artisanal proletariat of 1871 to the German proletariat of the 20s, the true proletariat. Here is the weakness. There is a true proletariat, but it does not have the consciousness. Thus, it is not the true one. You know what you say when that happens? But here comes an explanation based on various theorizations of the integration of a proletariat into bourgeois society. Always the crisis destroys it, and there will no longer be an obstacle to the prolet conscious meaning. Okay, that's a great response to what I just said. And briefly, it is the theory of the proletariat developed by the Italian left. The crisis is one of the links of the theory of that of value. The crisis is only truly real on the basis of the law of value, which in turn is only possible with reference to man. Man determined by a production process, and not abstract man, but a man who has antagonistic determination to capital, which is opposed to him. Now the crisis has been encapsulated by capital, and so there appears an impasse for the two theories. We do not wish to criticize them exhaustively, we simply wish to note the presupposition of the theory of the proletariat and its limits, given that this theory is one of the pillars of the origin and function. As said in this text, the scheme of the Communist Revolution was imposed on Marx by the observation of the course of the French Revolution. The bourgeoisie believed that it could liberate humanity. Here Marx did not make a reduction. He conceived this class in its human dimensions and its limitations. That's a great way of conceiving of it. This irrefutably proof of the check was the existence of the proletariat, which the bourgeois theorized and avoided in preoccupying itself with pauperism and extinction. Now this class is now passive. It rebels. Marx saw here the possibility, finally, to accomplish the task of reconciling men by eliminating class antagonism, because a class showed itself unlinked to any particular determination. The proletariat as negation. Also, following the Ricardian socialist, he presented this class in liaison with and on the basis of the law of value, and he added that the proletariat was the class producing surplus value, but did not stop at the discovery, and he analyzed the movement of capital, and stated its tendency to integrate the proletariat in the gay classes. However, this is always found as a tendency in Marx. The crisis can reinvigorate the negativity. We saw this to show where we enclosed in Marx's schema and where we have developed and somewhat exhausted its possibility. This prevented us from superseding the Marxian vision in 1961, although reality already imposed it, but it is also true of our predecessors of such a supersession ought to have been made in the 1920s. Certainly, one can find the element of the supersession among Marxists and anti-Marxists in the 1920 to 39 period, also in the immediate post-war period, but on one hand, they are definitely only feeble remarks that can be used now that the step has been taken, and on the other hand, we often only have a very recent knowledge of them. The Second World War eliminated the pile of documents which have only reappeared since 1968. Besides, we have already said that the revolutionary movement, during its emergence, will often not go beyond the resurrection of the immediate revolutionary past. We have not escaped such a phenomenon. Here, a critical analysis of the proletarian movement, from the beginning of the century above all, is needed. We begin with the KAPD et le mouvement prolétarien, Bourdieu et la question russe, Russie et nécessité du communisme, Bourdieu et la passion du communisme, and as well we shall do an analysis of the Spanish revolutionary movement and Casquian Joule, as with la révolution allemande et les spectres du prolétariat, an introduction to Hermann Gorder's The Communist Workers' International. Do we need to read all that? But that will not exhaust the critique of our historical behavior. That is, our way of representing history is situating ourselves in time. All historical reconstruction is participation in the past. We have to reconsider the representation Marx made of the proletariat and confront it with what the proletariat has really done. I thought that was called modernization. This question does not have the goal of projecting an anathema, but of locating clearly where and why there was an illusion. This will also not imply the revalorizing of prior anti-Marxist positions, above all as integral solution, e.g. democracy. Here, we are led to consider the second pillar of the origin and function, the Gemenweisen, but that is also to say that there was a certain contradiction between the theory of the proletariat and the research on the Gemenweisen. One saw this, but also maintained the hope that the real movement would dissolve it with the manifestation of the proletariat as a less class, which would thus not only have a classist character, but also its movement to constitute the community would lose its character. That is why we say that the proletariat was integrated into the CNP by its immediate beginning, not only by its immediate being, defined by its tendency and mission, and that afterwards the constitution of the party would be its immediate negation, but its negation of the proletariat, the party, would pose the human community. This began with the republication of the theses in number 6 and Transition, mainly written by Gianni Coulou. But here again we would make an accommodation. One can only leave its domain by superseding the theory of the proletariat in the labor value theory. This was realized in 1972. The abstract characteristics led to the representation of the concrete by the path of thought. The law of value, doubtlessly, was the representation of a concrete, but a representation it was not the concrete itself. The development of the concrete and of its representation are not closely linked, all the more as the thought concrete resulting in the law of value has not been the dominant characteristic. Wages, for example, have never been actually the price of labor, with all the implicit consequences, but as a more or less correct price for labor, and the profit as wages of the entrepreneur, and not the fruits of plundering. The dominant characteristic is part of the integrant relation of social praxis, and if the king is only king because his subjects see themselves as subject, this king is nonetheless not abstract but very real, and it is around this very real person that society is organized, because one had given the attribution of thought concrete, the revolutionary content of the law of value, to the representation that the proletariat became one, made the proletariat a revolutionary class, one established on the basis of law of value, representation of a concrete at a determined historical moment. The theory of the proletariat, because it is theory, has a basis in the law of value. Other theory, but there is self-justification of the two theories. Because the proletariat is a direct expression of living labor, it gives its content to the law of value, because labor is the content of the law of value. Its concrete reality, its substance. No proletariat, no law of value. Thus the need to provide a theoretical basis and a historical necessity to the proletariat, leaving the interpretation of history in order to not remove the proletariat from the political scene. Hence, moreover, the problem of the revolutionary movement, maintaining tautology and looping the theory, and finally participating in the tautological process of capital. If we have difficulty expressing this tautological process of capital, it is only because we participate in the same movement, and we use the same artifices to maintain the same theoretical and historical coherence without daring to make the supersession now required. What are fictitious capital, the universal class, etc., if not theoretical artifices? Besides put in stack by the very concrete reality of the revolution, we are led to produce the concepts of the real dimensions, its biological dimension, and here the too tight skin bursts under the pressure of such a developed content. We give the revolution directly the dimension of the species, a spatial and historic dimension, alongside which the moment of capital appears like a simple historical hiccup. A very understandable distraction is equally only by our enthusiasm, and we shall be reactionaries and revolutionaries, heretics and prophets. We've never been further from closer to Marx. Our contradiction is only his contradiction, implied by his historical developments. Letter of J. L. Donnerlet, 9/11/72.